I'm really tired this morning. It has been an exciting and an action-packed week. I was at annual conference for most of the week and then left Baltimore on Friday to drive up to Mercersburg, Pennsylvania for my stepdaughter's high school graduation. So it's been a long week and I have not had a day off. And God understands this. God did not intend for us to be running nonstop 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In fact, resting was so important for God that human beings knew the value of rest, that God made it a commandment. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Sabbath. That's an odd word, right? Do you guys say that? Oh, Friday I'm going to take my Sabbath. Me and my pastor friends say that all the time. We know, do you take a Sabbath? I haven't taken a Sabbath. I take my Sabbath on Thursday. That's how we talk. That's so other people don't know what we're talking about. It is an odd word, but it's an important word. It's important to know and understand the word and what God intended with the command for us to take a Sabbath. So I have a story from the book of Mark, which may help. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, where Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath so they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against Jesus, how to destroy him. The story begins with Jesus' disciples making a way through the fields, taking the left-behind grain as they go. And the Pharisees were upset that the disciples were traveling and gleaning on the Sabbath. They should have stayed put. They should have prepared their snacks the day before. To the Pharisees, this behavior appears to deliberately neglect the mandate to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. Remember, the Pharisees were the religious leaders who performed the socially necessary function of interpreting the law so that people could use it to shape their lives. Disputes over proper interpretation of the law were as necessary and part of their social construct as Supreme Court rulings are for us. Jesus disagreed with the Pharisees' claim that they were violating the Sabbath, not because he regarded the Sabbath commandment as trivial, but because he sees the bigger picture, the one that regards the Sabbath in a different light. Jesus turns to a story about David to interpret the purpose of the Sabbath. David took the consecrated bread that was meant only for the priests. David insisted that he was taking the bread because he was a fugitive, seeking allies and fleeing Saul, who had plans to kill him. Jesus implies that the priests did nothing wrong in breaking the strict letter of the law by allowing David to eat the bread. Because by feeding David, the priests sustained the life of a weary traveler and contribute to David's quest to live into his calling as the king anointed to replace Saul. Here, Jesus is offering his own legal opinion, that sometimes certain demands of the law are rightly set aside in favor of pursuing greater values and meeting greater needs, especially when those greater needs promote a person's well-being and aid the arrival of divine blessings. Jesus' argument wasn't new, and it certainly wasn't scandalous on its face. When he notes that the purpose of the Sabbath has always been to serve humankind as opposed to making humankind serve some stern religious principle. He's essentially repeating Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15, which says, "No working on the Sabbath. Keep it holy, just as God your God commanded you. Work 6 days, doing everything you have to do, but the seventh is a Sabbath, a day of rest. No work, not you, not your son or your daughter or your servant, not your maid or your ox or your donkey or any of your animals, not even a foreigner visiting your town. That way your servants and your maids will have the same rest as you. Don't ever forget you were slaves in Egypt, and God, your God, got you out of there in a powerful show of strength. That's why God, your God, commands you to observe the Sabbath rest." God instituted the Sabbath so that people who were once slaves could forever enjoy at least one day of rest. The proper function of the Sabbath is to promote life and to extol God as liberator. In Jesus' time, everybody knew that. The Pharisees understood the Sabbath too. So why are they giving Jesus such a hard time? Maybe they didn't appreciate that it was Jesus who was giving legal advice. I mean, who does he think he is? He's just a new teacher. He thinks too much of himself. What bothered the Pharisees the most was that Jesus was comparing himself to David, whom they all knew had been called to be king. Jesus declaring himself as Lord of the Sabbath didn't sit well either. Was Jesus claiming that the law's ultimate purpose was to serve Jesus himself? The real scandal of this story is that Jesus was no ordinary teacher. The real scandal of this story is that Jesus is revealing his mission to shake up strongly held religious and social convictions of his time. Jesus was speaking the truth of the law. And the reality is that truth often upsets people. The next part of the story, where Jesus heals the man's hand in the synagogue, intensifies the conflict over Jesus' authority, his values, and the urgency of his claims. For the Pharisees who lie in wait, watching, the issue is not whether Jesus has the power to heal the man's hand. It's whether doing so on the Sabbath demonstrates a willful disregard of God's law. A law they believed gave good order to life and provided conditions for encountering God's blessing and holiness. Jesus' response to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save or to kill?" indicates that he disagrees with the premise of their suspicion. In healing the man's hand, Jesus did not disparage or break the law in any way. While Jesus was not honoring the letter of the law, he was honoring the purpose of the Sabbath, to save and preserve life. What better day is there than the Sabbath, a day meant to promote God's commitment to humanity's well-being for the restoration of a man's malformed hand? And the truth is, his Jewish contemporaries should not have found this perspective especially troublesome. The ancient rabbinic tradition held that saving life overrules the Sabbath. So the man wasn't dying, right? His hand was withered. But Jesus' determination to heal him demonstrates the urgency of Jesus' life-giving work. With the restoration of his hand, the man in the synagogue also receives the ability to work in the Galilean economy. In receiving that ability, he can now provide for his family. In the act of healing the man's hand, Jesus had restored him to wholeness and dignity. Jesus violated the letter of the law, not working on the Sabbath, in order to live out the spirit of the law, to promote life and human flourishing. In these two scenes, Jesus did not attack Judaism. He did not reject the law. He did not render the Sabbath obsolete. He did not disparage the Pharisees. Nonetheless, the disagreement about living within the law quickly escalated to hostility. And that hostility would eventually lead some of the most powerful religious leaders to seek Jesus' humiliation and death. Even as the story emphasizes a commitment to life and vitality abiding at the heart of God's reign, it also illustrates how religious commitments and values, any religious commitment and values, can harden and turn oppressive in the hands of careless stewards. None are immune. In many ways, the entire Gospel of Mark tells a story of recurring controversy. Passages like this one help us interpret the controversies and also, eventually, the events at the end of the narrative where Jesus dies on the cross. As Donald Jewell put it, for us, as for Mark, the cross ought to be a sober reminder of how easily the most noble motives can be perverted. It points out how quickly an institution can become an end unto itself, stifling legitimate concerns of those outside that may seem to threaten stability. It illustrates how frequently insidious forces we scarcely notice can transform the best educated, best intentioned among us into insensitive leaders, desperately out of touch with what is real. Such insensitivity and brokenness moved Jesus to grief in the synagogue, where he considers the stony Pharaoh-like hearts that regard the letter of the law as more valuable than removing suffering and disadvantage before the sun sets. But Mark also has good news to announce. In these stories, we see Jesus, the inbreaking reign of God, who preaches compassion and transformation. Jesus, like the God who instituted the Sabbath, is committed to preserving life. His ministry will expose the oppressive and corrosive tyrannies of fear, imperial pretense, and religious hypocrisy wherever they reside. And finally, he will deliver us all from them. In the book of Matthew, chapter 22, Jesus is asked by a lawyer which commandment is the greatest, which law is most important. Jesus responded by saying, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets." With these words, Jesus clearly articulates the spirit of the law he wants us to follow, and his advice is still relevant and valuable. As in Jesus' time, we can get bogged down in the letter of the law rather than following the Spirit. This happens when we don't love our neighbor, when we legalistically reject the inherent value of all people, when we leave people without access to health and wholeness, when we cheat people out of the possibility of a living wage, deny them hope of real refuge from real threats, and blame victims for the abuse they endure. As long as these failings exist, conflict will remain a part of gospel ministry. Denouncing false construal of reality so that the reign of God might be announced and visible in word and deed still causes trouble. But it's good trouble. Mark insists that God would have us see a different landscape and hear a different song. The book of Mark originally was, and still is, a guide to help each of us determine what is real, what is healthy, and most of all, with God, what is possible. Let us pray.